Something major just shook the political landscape, and most people didn't see it coming. Out of nowhere, Marjorie Taylor Greene made a move so sudden and so drastic that it instantly shifted the tone in Washington. There was no buildup, no quiet warning signs, just a clean, hard break paired with a message directed straight at Donald Trump. Within minutes, the political world was on fire. But while that drama was unfolding, Minnesota was being hit by a completely different kind of explosion. One involving fraud, millions in stolen taxpayer money, and allegations reaching far beyond state borders. These stories broke almost back to back, and together they reveal a moment where trust, loyalty, and accountability are being tested like never before. Most people by now have seen Marjorie Taylor Greene's video announcement. The tone was striking, more personal than political. She talked about dignity, about the toll politics takes on families, and about how Washington, in her words, devours people who genuinely try to represent everyday Americans. She argued that both political parties have mastered a simple game: convince voters to hate the other side just a little more each election, while nothing actually improves for ordinary people. According to her, the debt rises, corporations stay protected, and Americans keep struggling. Then she dropped the bombshell. She wasn't retiring. She was resigning, effective early January. That distinction may sound small, but inside Congress, it's massive. When a member retires, they stay until the end of their term, keeping their vote in place. But a resignation creates an empty seat immediately. And in a House where Republicans hold a razor-thin majority, every seat matters. Her departure would directly weaken her own party's grip on power. And she knew that. So why do it? Greene said she refused to spend months enduring what she described as a hateful primary backed by the very president she once supported wholeheartedly. She said she had too much self-respect, too much love for her family, and too much concern for her district to go through what she called a battered wife cycle, hoping things would get better. That kind of language told the world that something inside that political relationship had fractured completely. Trump responded almost immediately on Truth Social. He said Greene was leaving because her poll numbers were collapsing and she knew she could not survive a primary challenger with his endorsement. He also attacked her relationship with Congressman Thomas Massie, calling him one of the worst Republicans in decades. Trump said Greene's alliance with Massie made her go bad, and that he eventually stopped answering her phone calls. But then, at the very end, he added a softer note, saying he appreciated her service. It was a bizarre mix of personal criticism and reluctant gratitude, signaling just how personal this split had become. Trump responded almost immediately on Truth Social. He said Greene was leaving because her poll numbers were collapsing and she knew she could not survive a primary challenger with his endorsement. He also attacked her relationship with Congressman Thomas Massie, calling him one of the worst Republicans in decades. Trump said Greene's alliance with Massie made her go bad, and that he eventually stopped answering her phone calls. But then, at the very end, he added a softer note, saying he appreciated her service. It was a bizarre mix of personal criticism and reluctant gratitude, signaling just how personal this split had become. Representative Tim Burchett added more fuel to the fire. When asked about the feud, he didn't mince words. He said this wasn't about policy, it was a personality clash that had been building for years. He pointed out that Greene had become increasingly independent and was upset over several issues, especially Trump's strong alignment with Israel. Burchett also suggested she disagreed with Trump on how to handle the release of Epstein files, issue that divides many inside the GOP. Taken together, the differences weren't small. They were ideological collisions. This is significant because Greene was once one of Trump's most loyal defenders. She echoed his messaging, appeared at his rallies, and positioned herself at the center of the MAGA movement. So for someone that loyal to break away, this sharply and publicly reveals deeper fractures inside the Republican Party. Greene's decision shows that certain factions feel emboldened enough to step away from Trump, even if it weakens the party strategically. But the political earthquake didn't stop there. While Washington was reeling from Greene's resignation, Minnesota was uncovering one of the largest fraud schemes in the state's history. And this wasn't about one program. It was about multiple systems being exploited at once. The first scandal centered on housing stabilization services, a Medicaid program intended to help seniors, people with addiction struggles, and vulnerable individuals stay housed. The program originally cost the state a few $1,000,000 a year, but in just 4 years that number exploded to over $100 million. That kind of growth isn't natural. It's a blaring siren. Investigators uncovered systematic fraud, claims for services that never happened, families pressured to participate, and networks directing money out of the state. Several individuals, many of them from Somali community circles, were charged. And again, investigators stressed, this was not about an entire community. It was about organized groups taking advantage of loose rules and weak oversight. But the biggest shock came from a different program. Minnesota's autism therapy services costs skyrocketed from around $3 million a year to nearly $400 million in just a few years. Investigators discovered a coordinated scheme involving recruiting families, encouraging unnecessary or false autism diagnoses, and setting up therapy centers that existed mostly on paper. Some providers were competing for families by offering checks and kickbacks. Therapy wasn't the product Medicaid money was. The most disturbing part, much of the money didn't stay in the United States. Investigators found a trail leading overseas, including to Somalia. While legal remittances are common, these transactions didn't follow normal patterns. According to federal reports, some funds appeared to have been routed into channels used by Al-Shabaab, a known terrorist organization. Authorities are now treating portions of this case as a potential national security issue. Then Trump weighed in again. He accused Minnesota leadership of allowing widespread fraud and declared he was immediately ending temporary protected status, TPS, for Somali nationals in the state, adding the phrase, send them back to where they came from. It's over. The legality of such a targeted TPS termination is already being questioned. But politically, the message was unmistakable. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar responded, immediately saying most Somali Americans are citizens and that the policy wouldn't affect them. Her message was defiant. We are here to stay. Her response highlighted a deep cultural and political tension between immigration policy, identity, and real criminal cases unfolding simultaneously. The truth is complex. Most Somali Americans are hardworking, law-abiding citizens building lives in the United States. But it is also true that specific organized fraud networks, many operating within that community, did exploit these programs. The challenge is addressing large-scale fraud without painting entire communities with a broad brush. And then came yet another case, feeding our future. Investigators say over $300 million was stolen through fraudulent meal claims during the pandemic. One small grocery store was accused of claiming to have provided more than 300,000 meals out of a space not even large enough to host a few dozen people. The scale, investigators say, is staggering. Taken together, all of these events, Green's sudden resignation, the internal GOP fracture, the Minnesota fraud investigations, accusations of money traveling to terror networks, and Trump's sweeping TPS declaration paint a picture of a nation facing multiple stress points at once. Political alliances are breaking, public programs are being exploited, communities are on edge, and the federal government is stepping in aggressively. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. This isn't just about politics or fraud or immigration. It's about trust. Who has it, who's losing it, and what happens when entire systems begin to crack. The deeper investigators dug into the feeding our future scandal, the more surreal the story became. One of the most unbelievable twists involved a small convenience store owner who had already been disqualified from a federal nutrition program for suspected fraud. But somehow, through loopholes, weak oversight, or sheer administrative blindness, he still managed to access feeding our future funds. And not just a few dollars. We're talking about hundreds of thousands. According to the indictment, this store owner directed more than $200,000 of that money toward purchasing the very building where his shop was located. When reporters confronted him about it, he didn't deny it. In fact, he almost sounded proud. He said, "If I own this building and I want to be here for the next 20 or 30 years, nobody can kick me out. It's mine." To him, it was simple. Control your space, control your future. But the federal government doesn't share that view. Their position is crystal clear. Property purchased with stolen federal funds isn't yours. It's subject to forfeiture. And that's exactly what the indictment states. The building itself can be taken by the government to recoup losses. The problem, of course, is that much of the stolen money is already gone. Investigators traced wire transfers to Hong Kong, money moved so quickly that following It was nearly impossible. They found credit card bills paid off with fraud funds. They uncovered alleged bribes paid to employees of Feeding Our Future to ignore suspicious activity. And once money starts moving across borders, especially into opaque financial havens, recovering it becomes a fantasy rather than a realistic objective. But the scandal wasn't just about fraud. It spiraled into something darker, something straight out of a crime thriller. Because several people charged in the case didn't just commit financial crimes. They allegedly tried to obstruct justice in one of the most dangerous ways imaginable, by tampering with a federal jury. Prosecutors say the group targeted a single juror, juror number 52. Because she was the youngest juror and the only juror of color, they believed she would be more vulnerable, more persuadable, easier to manipulate. What happened next was chilling. Documents reveal they searched online and gathered personal information about her and her family. They monitored her movements. They physically tracked her. They even placed a GPS tracker on her car to know exactly where she went, when she left home, and how long she stayed in each location. This wasn't amateur improvisation. This was coordinated, deliberate, and deeply dangerous. And then came the bribe. One night someone left a bag at her home. Inside the bag, $120,000 in cash. Along with it, a clear message: vote not guilty, and the money is yours. This wasn't subtle. It wasn't symbolic. It was an attempt to buy a verdict, undermine a federal trial, and collapse an investigation involving hundreds of millions of dollars, meant to feed children. Fortunately, Juror 52 didn't bend. She immediately reported the bribe to authorities. Because of her integrity, the trial continued. The investigation remained intact, and several defendants were ultimately convicted. But the fact remains, had she stayed silent, the entire case could have fallen apart. One of the individuals involved in the bribery scheme fled the country. According to reports, he returned to Somalia before the indictments were made public. And this pattern repeated itself. Out of the 77 people charged in the broader Feeding Our Future conspiracy, more than 50 have been convicted. But not all are within reach. Several have escaped the country. And as for the money, much of it is gone forever. After these revelations came to light, the Minneapolis police chief held a press conference to address the growing crisis and the community's reaction. He stood alongside a translator to ensure his message reached Somali community members in their own language. His tone was serious, respectful, and cautious. He thanked the Somali community for being welcoming and stressed that cooperation between law enforcement and the community was essential. But then he added something unexpected. He apologized. He said that if anything he had said about the investigation caused harm or was taken out of context, he was sorry. He emphasized that harming the community was never his intention. And while his goal was clearly to preserve trust and prevent tension, many watching were left unsettled. Because here was a police chief standing in the middle of one of the largest fraud investigations in Minnesota's history, apologizing for doing his job. His apology wasn't about misconduct. It wasn't about mistreatment. It was about the possibility of offending people while speaking truth. And that raises a difficult but important question. Have we reached a point where public officials are more afraid of being criticized for insensitivity than they are committed to enforcing the law? Because when fraud reaches this scale, affecting children, seniors, families in need, walking on eggshells can come at a real cost. Programs meant to help the vulnerable ended up drained. Housing services for seniors were overwhelmed. Autism support funds were misused. Food programs for children became fronts for theft. Meanwhile, the people actually responsible for the crimes were sometimes treated more delicately than the victims of the fraud. When we look at all of this together, Washington's political battles, Minnesota's fraud epidemic, national security concerns tied to overseas money movement, it becomes clear that these aren't isolated events. There's a pattern of systems breaking down and accountability becoming diluted. Marjorie Taylor Greene's dramatic resignation from Congress is part of that same pattern. Her very public break from Donald Trump, once her strongest political ally, reveals Republican Party fractured by competing agendas, clashing personalities, and shifting loyalties. Whether Greene's departure was a principled stand or a strategic retreat depends on who you ask. But what's undeniable is that it signals instability within a political movement once defined by unity around Trump. That instability mirrors what's unfolding in Minnesota, a system built on good intentions, failing under corruption and negligence. There, the cracks are financial. In Washington, they're political. But the root problem is the same. Trust is evaporating. Trust in leaders who promise to serve the people but often prioritize vendettas and personal ambition. Trust in government systems intended to help the vulnerable, but instead exploited by opportunists. Trust in institutions responsible for justice, but sometimes paralyzed by fear of public backlash. The frustration people feel isn't partisan, it's universal. Because whether you lean conservative or liberal, whether you support Trump or oppose him, whether you agree with Green or think she's reckless, the basic expectation remains the same. The people in power should protect the public interest. Trump's decision to end temporary protected status for Somali nationals living in Minnesota is controversial. Some see it as a necessary response to a systemic breakdown. Others see it as unfairly punitive toward people completely uninvolved in the fraud. And the truth is, both arguments have valid points. What's clear is that the fraud exposed massive failures in oversight. It showed vulnerabilities in federal programs, and it revealed a sophisticated network willing not only to steal but to intimidate, bribe, and manipulate the justice system. At the same time, Green's resignation exposed vulnerabilities in political leadership, how quickly alliances can shift, how fractured the GOP has become, and how unpredictable the landscape is heading into the next election cycle. So what ties these stories together? Accountability. Who is accountable to voters? Who is accountable to taxpayers? Who is accountable when things go wrong? And who is willing to take responsibility rather than hide behind rhetoric or excuses? The truth is, these stories matter because they show us what's broken. They force us to confront uncomfortable realities about our political system, our social programs, and our leadership. And they remind us that meaningful change only happens when people demand it. Change starts with awareness. It starts with asking difficult questions. It starts with refusing to accept narratives that downplay serious issues. And it starts with remembering that accountability is not optional. It's the foundation of trust. So now the question is yours. Was Marjorie Taylor Greene's resignation an act of principle or political calculation? And do you believe Trump's response to the Minnesota scandal was justified, or was it too sweeping? If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and join the conversation in the comments. Because stories like this affect all of us, and understanding them is the first step toward fixing what's broken. And as always, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.